Hello and welcome back for another Torah Tuesday. We have finally made it to the 10 Commandments, and today we're going to start with Exodus 20 verses 1 and 2, which aren't technically the commands yet, but they're setting us up for the commands. So we need to lay some groundwork so that the rest of the chapter will make sense. So some of the questions we're going to address today are: what are the 10 Commandments? Who are they for? And we want to pay attention to when are they given. So I'm going to begin as usual by reading my translation of the first 2 verses. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I myself am Yahweh, your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of servitude. Okay, so first question, what are the 10 Commandments? So the whole context has set us up to understand them as covenant stipulations. These are the specific commands given to the people in covenant with Yahweh, consisting mostly of prohibitions that protect the community from destructive behaviors. And that idea I'm drawing from Terence Fredheim's great commentary on Exodus for the Interpretation series. These are protective commands. They make sure that each person is loyal to God and loyal to their neighbor, showing love for God and love for neighbor. So they're embedded in this idea of a covenant. The covenant that God made with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and 15 is now passed down to his descendants, the people that God brought out of Egypt. These commands are delivered verbally by God to the people he rescued from Egypt, to Abraham's descendants. So we noticed in chapter 19, which we studied over the past 3 weeks, that Moses makes several trips up and down the mountain. And when he goes up, God speaks to him, and he brings God's words down to the people, and he brings the people's words up to God. And so there's been an up, down. But that at the end of chapter 19, Moses is down at the base of the mountain with the people, having just warned them again not to ascend the mountain. So when chapter 20 opens with God speaking, the narrative has set us up to understand this as divine speech directly to the whole community. So Moses is not mediating these words. They're directly delivered by God to the people. That underscores their importance. And all of the up and down the mountain has prepared us to understand how momentous this occasion is. They had to prepare themselves for 3 days. They had careful boundaries set around the mountain. There's a sense of the awe of being in God's presence, the danger of being in his presence, and that this is not something to be taken lightly. It's really important that we notice that these commands were not given to the people while they were in Egypt. These are not a prerequisite for salvation or a way of Israel earning salvation. They're instead a means of carrying out their mission to represent God in the world. And we talked about that mission a little bit in the video on Exodus 19 verses 1 through 6. That's where God calls them a kingdom of priests and a holy nation and God's treasured representatives. The Hebrew word segala sets us up to understand that they've been appointed to a particular vocation of representing God among the nations. The law is going to be their means of living out that vocation. So this is not how they get saved. It's how they carry out their mission. That also leads us to conclude that these are not universal moral prohibitions. They're not timeless, but they are the constitution of a new nation. That's not often how the 10 Commandments are thought of. People often think of them as the foundation for general morality, but of course, it's good for all people to follow these commands, right? But the Bible presents the commands as being specific for the Israelites, the ones that God has already rescued. So a couple of other things we can point out. So God spoke these words, which echoes the creation event in Genesis chapter 1, where God spoke the world into existence, and he spoke and it became ordered and filled with all of its proper residents. This implies that what we're reading in Exodus chapter 20 is a creation story. It's the creation of a new nation, and this will be their stipulations, their constitution, if you will, for the new nation. God spoke all these words. The word davar in Hebrew has a bit of a more flexible meaning or broader meaning than our English word. Davar can mean instruction, matter, issue, word. So what we're getting is all these instructions or all these matters or all these words. Now, we find in 3 other passages that the Bible refers to the commands that follow as the 10 words. The Bible never refers to them in Hebrew as 10 commandments. There's another word for commandment, mitzvot, or mitzvah, mitzvot is the plural, commandments. That is not how these are described, even though they contain commandments. Exodus 34:28, Deuteronomy 4:13, and Deuteronomy 10:4 are all passages that speak of the 10 words. That's a woodenly literal way of saying it. It's the 10 matters, the 10 instructions, the 10... But notice that it's a little more flexible and broader or more generic than the word command. The 10 are remarkably difficult to count. There are 2 competing ways of counting them preserved in the Hebrew Bible itself. The accent system marks off 10 commands or 10 words, two different ways side by side. And the history of interpretation is divided over how we should enumerate these commands. So we'll talk in next week's video about what the implications are of that, about how we count them, but we know there are 10 from the passages I already listed. Notice that God's first thing he says to them is to point back to, first of all, his name. He identifies himself as Yahweh, your God, but also the God who has done something. He's brought them out of Egypt, out of the house of servitude. So freedom, the rescue from slavery, is the basis for the Decalogue. It's what gives God the right to be making these demands on the people. But it's also the ongoing character of these commands. That is to say, the Decalogue is not a new ball and chain that is enslaving these people, but that freedom was the prerequisite for their new life together under God as his people. But it's also going to characterize their life with God. They are going to have freedom, and their freedom involves an invitation to surrender themselves to this new master who is both good and benevolent and compassionate and just and all these things. So because God is such a good master, apprenticing themselves to him or surrendering themselves to him is going to be a positive thing. I want to read just 2 quotes from a book on the 10 Commandments that I really like. This is by a French writer, Lochman. It's called Signposts to Freedom, the 10 Commandments and Christian Ethics. He says a couple of things that I think are really helpful just to set the stage. He says on page 17, recent Old Testament scholarship rightly points out that to regard the Decalogue as a timeless, universal code of moral rules is to misunderstand it completely. So they emerge in the specific setting at Sinai to a specific people who have been redeemed from slavery. He goes on to say, the Decalogue is seen in the Old Testament as part of the salvation history and also, therefore, as a witness to historical events. The revelation of the 10 Commandments comes to Israel, the people of God, not from somewhere beyond space and time, but very concretely at a particular time and in a particular place, that is, at Sinai during the events of the Exodus. The text of the Decalogue is quite inseparable from this actual history and can never be understood correctly in isolation from that history. To interpret the Decalogue legalistically is to tear it out of this living context and so to sterilize it. So I hope that is helpful. We're going to go into each of the commands in future videos, so I hope you stick with us. There's so much rich theology here and so much for us to consider for the Christian life today. In the meantime, have a great week.